The bells of Europe rang out across the ruins. Rifles fired into the sky, flags fluttered in the wind, and crowds wept in the streets. It was May 1945, the end of 6 years of unimaginable destruction. The war that had swallowed a continent was finally over. But for one small group of women standing in the shadows of broken railway yards, this was not a day of liberation. It was the beginning of something they could not yet name, a journey into the heart of the enemy. Their uniforms hung loose on their thin frames, the tattered gray-green of the Reich's auxiliaries, their boots split at the seams, their faces streaked with soot. Some were barely 20, their eyes still holding the ghost of youth behind exhaustion. They were secretaries, radio operators, nurses, not soldiers, but the remnants of a machine that had crumbled around them. Now they were prisoners. They had been promised glory. Instead, they stood in lines, clutching battered suitcases, waiting to be herded onto trains that once carried troops to the front. But these trains would not carry them home. They would carry them into captivity. A girl from Hamburg whispered, "The Americans will make examples of us." She had heard it from an officer before the surrender. Another woman, older, harder, said nothing. Her jaw was set, her silence heavier than words. For years they had been told that the Allies were monsters, men without mercy. Now, as the trains rumbled westward through a land of ruins, those lies were all they had left to believe in. The countryside slid by like a ghost of the world they had known. Towns burned to ash, bridges lay twisted in rivers. Children waved from the roadside, hollow-eyed, skeletal. At night the trains stopped, and the women huddled together for warmth. Beyond the wooden walls came the sound of boots on gravel, the crack of a distant rifle, and sometimes silence, the most frightening sound of all. In the dim light of a boxcar, one woman, Anna, a secretary from Munich, opened a small diary she had hidden in her coat. She wrote, "We are being taken far. None knows where. My mother will think I am dead. Perhaps I will be." Days later, the trains reached the ports, Bremen, Le Havre, Cherbourg, cities now under Allied control. There, under the watchful eyes of American soldiers, the women were marched toward ships waiting in the harbor. Their hearts pounded with dread. The propaganda had painted America as a land of wolves. They expected jeers, blows, humiliation. But what they found was something far stranger. Paperwork, organization, efficiency. They were counted, tagged, divided into groups. It was not mercy, but it was not vengeance either. It was something in between, a cold, distant order that confused them more than hatred ever could. When the ship's engines roared to life, the coastline of Europe began to fade behind them. For hours, none spoke. The Atlantic stretched endless before them. The road to the unknown, to America. The voyage was brutal. Seasickness gripped many. The air below deck was thick with salt and diesel. The bunks were steel, stacked tight, and the women slept shoulder to shoulder. Yet when food came, pale bread, slabs of meat, steaming mugs of coffee, they froze in disbelief. Real food, real bread. For years they had eaten cabbage stalks and sawdust loaves. Now, before them, was a feast. Some wept silently as they ate. Others refused, fearing poison. But the food was real. The warmth was real. And that frightened them more than cruelty ever could. When the ships reached America, New York, Boston, New Orleans, the women stood on deck, clutching the rails, staring at skylines untouched by war. The Statue of Liberty rose in the distance. To them, it was not a symbol of freedom, but of irony, a monument to the victors. Crowds gathered on the piers. Some shouted. Most just watched, curious. The women marched down the gangways, their boots echoing on wooden planks. The air smelled strange, clean, alive, untouched by ash. For the first time, they felt how completely their world had collapsed. Germany was rubble. America was whole. Buses carried them inland, through green fields and shining towns. Children rode bicycles down sunlit streets. Stores were open. Houses gleamed with white porches. It was everything their homeland had promised and never delivered. And as the miles rolled by, their certainty began to unravel. The buses stopped at camps. Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and others. Tall fences, guard towers, rows of wooden barracks. Yet even here something felt wrong, or rather, too right. The paths were swept, the buildings painted, the guards calm. It did not look like a prison born of hatred. It looked like a place built for order. Still, when they were led into a building where steam hissed and water dripped, fear returned. They whispered to one another, "This is where they will make us suffer." But inside, instead of cruelty, they were handed bars of soap. Real soap, white, heavy, scented faintly of flowers. The showers released hot water that stung their skin. For the first time in years, they felt clean. Some wept openly. Others laughed in disbelief. It was not humiliation. It was rebirth. And that simple act, the soap in their hands, would haunt them longer than the war itself. That night, lying in clean bunks, Anna wrote in her diary again, "We were told we would be broken. Instead, we were given soap. How can this be?" The next morning, they were marched to the mess hall. The smell of coffee and bread filled the air. Tables overflowed with food, potatoes, beef stew, buttered rolls. They stood frozen at the doorway, as though they had stumbled into a dream. A guard motioned them forward. They hesitated. The first woman stepped up, trembling, and accepted a tray. Then another, then another. When Anna tasted the stew, her eyes widened. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears burning in her throat. Around her, others ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons and the sound of quiet sobbing. For years they had been fed lies, that the enemy was cruel, inhuman. Now, in the enemy's camp, they were being fed like human beings. Days passed. Then weeks. The women were given light work, in kitchens, in laundries, in fields. They were paid in camp scrip, small paper notes they could use at the canteen. There they found things they had not seen in years: chocolate, cigarettes, pencils, lipstick. When Anna bit into her first bar of chocolate, the sweetness hit her like a shock. She turned away, ashamed of her own tears. A girl beside her whispered, "I feel human again." The words hung in the air. Fragile. Dangerous. Letters from home began to arrive. Torn, censored, filled with despair. "We live in the cellar now. The house above is gone. We boil weeds for soup." The women folded the letters with trembling fingers. They ate their meals in silence that night. The taste of guilt sharper than any hunger. The Americans treated them not as monsters, nor as guests, but as something in between. Prisoners, yes, but prisoners of a civilized war. The irony was unbearable. Each kindness, each meal, each bar of soap became a quiet torment. For they realized that the enemy had shown them more humanity than their own leaders ever had. One evening, a young guard dropped his flashlight during roll call. Anna instinctively picked it up and handed it back. Their fingers brushed. He nodded, a brief human gesture. She remembered it for days. Another time, a soldier whistled a tune. A German girl recognized the melody and hummed along. For a fleeting moment, the war dissolved. Two enemies shared a song. The days turned into months. The women grew stronger, their faces fuller, their hair shining again. Some even laughed. They no longer feared being beaten. They feared something else, being changed. For as they lived among their captors, they saw a world that worked. A world where order was not built on fear. They saw children fed, cities whole, skies unscarred by bombs. And the more they saw, the harder it became to cling to the hatred they had been taught. Anna wrote in her diary, "Hatred is easy. Dignity is unbearable. They feed us, clothe us, pay us, and every kindness feels like a wound. As autumn came, the camp seemed almost peaceful. Leaves drifted across the yard. The women laughed over coffee. Some even sang. But beneath the calm, unease grew. They knew captivity would end. They would be sent home, back to rubble, back to hunger. And the thought terrified them, because now they knew what life could be, and they knew what their country had destroyed. When word came of repatriation, the barracks fell silent. Anna stared at her diary one last time. Her final entry read, "I fear leaving more than I feared arriving. The enemy's greatest weapon was not hate, but kindness, and it has undone us all." The next morning, frost clung to the fences. The buses waited. As the women stepped aboard, they carried no trophies, no victories, only questions. What if everything they had believed had been a lie? What if the enemy they were taught to fear had been more human than those who claimed to lead them? The engines started. The gates opened. And as the convoy rolled eastward, the women looked out at the American dawn, bright, endless, and heartbreakingly foreign. The war was over, but for them, the battle between hatred and humanity had only just begun.